Thank you again, everyone, for joining this Education Writers Association webinar, Reporter Roundtable, following the education stimulus funds in 2021. My name is Stacia, and I'm a program manager here at EWA. So I will now hand over the microphone to Megan Mangrum, who is an education and children's issues reporter at the Tennessean. Megan will be today's moderator. So take it away, Megan.
Thanks, Stacia. I'd like to welcome our two speakers here today. Hopefully they'll be doing more talking than me. First, we have Andrew Ujifusa, assistant editor at Education Week. And Andrew will help us understand the K-12 items in the stimulus package. And then we have Eric Kelderman, senior reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Eric will help us through the big items on the higher ed side. So let's get started with K-12. Andrew, can we start by providing an overview of what's in the bill, maybe some of the big ticket items? What are states and schools being directed to do, how to spend this money?
Sure, Megan. So the most basic number to know is that the American Rescue Plan provides nearly $130 billion for K-12 education activities. And just to put that in a little bit of perspective, for this budget year, not for emergency COVID funding, but in this regular budget year, the U.S. Department of Education has about $40 billion for K-12 education. So the American Rescue Plan is about 3 times that. And if you go back even further, the 2009 stimulus to counteract the Great Recession had about $100 billion for K-12. And if you combine the 3 COVID relief bills that have had, money specifically for K-12, it's nearly $200 billion from those 3 relief packages. So we're talking about a lot of money. The bulk of that is in an emergency relief fund for state and local education agencies. It's about $122 billion. Most of that, about 9 out of every $10 is reserved for local education agencies, school districts. The money goes out by Title I, which means in practice that districts with large shares of economically disadvantaged students are going to get more than the average, but it's over $2,000 per student nationwide, basically. And it's actually easier to list the things that the money can't be used for, isn't mentioned for. There's such a long list that the American Rescue Plan mentions that this money can be used for. Student meals, mental health services, hygiene, just all kinds of things, education technology. But the one thing I would just highlight is that for districts, they have to use at least 20% of their money to address learning recovery or learning loss, depending on what term you like. I know that learning loss is a little bit of a controversial term, but 20% of their money from the American Rescue Plan has to go to learning recovery. It has to be for evidence-based programs. The law doesn't define those exactly, but we might be getting some more guidance from the feds on that score.
Yeah, that leads me to one question. Will school districts likely get a lot of guidance from their local state education departments, or do you think there'll still be a lot of wiggle room for local school districts on how to spend the money?
That's a good question. I think in general, a lot of the decisions will be left up to local school districts. They're the ones in many cases states would feel would know the needs of their students the best. And moreover, the American Rescue Plan provides a lot of flexibility for districts. Now, there are some set-asides, in addition to the ones I mentioned at the district level. There are some set-asides for states more broadly where they have to spend a certain amount of money on summer enrichment programs, on after-school programs. There's also money set aside specifically for homeless students. That group of students has caused a lot of concern about, where they stand, where they are during the pandemic. And I think, those different pots of funds and the students they're supposed to help, those are all, fertile ground for story ideas, for reporters to explore. But in general, I think districts will have a lot of flexibility in large part because they're given a lot of decision-making power by the American Rescue Plan.
And like you mentioned, this is a lot of federal dollars. I know that one of the districts I cover, the amount of money that they'll be receiving from this third round is more than twice what their normal operating budget is in a year. And I'm sure a lot of other districts are in similar spots. So how long do they have to spend it? What's your understanding of the process that it will be released to school districts? When will they start seeing the money? And then how long do they have until they have to spend it?
Sure, those are all good questions. So yesterday, Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona announced sort of state awards of the money, basically saying this is how much money each state's going to get. And so we should see states getting the money from the federal government pretty soon. Now, then, in turn, states have about 60 days, I think 60 days exactly, to award the money that's available to local school districts to the districts. Now, in terms of how long districts have to spend or allocate the money, which can be an important distinction, there's a consensus. It's not explicitly stated in the American Rescue Plan, but there's a consensus among folks who track these sort of things that schools have until September 30th of 2024 to obligate the money in some way, if not actually spend it. And this has actually been an issue that's been brought up in Washington in terms of how quickly some folks think the money is being spent. Some folks think it's money from previous relief packages hasn't been spent fast enough. Some of those concerns are I would say, off base and sort of miss sort of important distinctions about when money is spent versus when it's allocated and awarded. They're different things. You can award a contract but not actually spend the money for a while. So districts have a fair amount of time to award and allocate this money. On the one hand, this is an emergency, right? And folks are going to be asking questions about what are you doing to help students in schools now? But as we also know, this is not going to be a short-term issue. Students in schools have never dealt with an issue like this before. All the challenges that are so acute that the pandemic has created. So I think schools are going to be addressing this for some time.
One more question, and this will be something I ask Eric as well. But what are some of the appropriate uses? You've named some uses for this money, but when we talk about how long they have to spend it, for example, PPE and some of those safety protocols that maybe districts that are already open don't have as much of those costs. Is there an argument or is there like any controversy around what lawmakers versus community members consider appropriate uses?
Sure. So I think to address your question, I think that for this third round of K-12 education relief in the American Rescue Plan, you did see, unlike in the past two packages, a clear set aside, a priority for learning recovery, for academic services, which I mentioned earlier, that 20% that districts have to use. So I think there's definitely a sentiment in Washington that okay, maybe there should be less of an emphasis on, like you mentioned, PPE and hygiene and sort of the mitigation strategies against COVID-19 and sort of looking ahead, if not this spring, then into the summer and into next year about how this money should be used. And it is a fair question for reporters to ask of districts, how much are you using this money and previous relief money from other packages for this spring versus how much are you reserving for the summer or the next school year? I think that is something that reporters should be asking. And there's been a lot of analysis about the best strategies for schools to use to address learning recovery, and there are creative approaches. In Ed Week recently, we highlighted a district in Texas that is extending the school year, but they're bringing other things into that as well. In addition to extending the school year, they're trying to connect students with their most highly rated teachers, and those teachers are rated on various metrics, but they're trying to get the most highly rated teachers involved. And they're also bringing in fourth and fifth year college students as sort of interns to support those teachers. And tutoring is something where there are a lot of questions for reporters to ask. How much is it going to cost? Who's going to be doing the tutoring? Is it necessarily the regular classroom teachers they're used to seeing? So that's just one example of how there are different potential avenues for districts to take in terms of using this money, and really good questions for reporters to ask about it.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll definitely have more questions for you, but I want to transition over to Eric for some of our higher ed reporters. Eric, can you give us an overview of what colleges and universities can expect?
Sure. Well, you know, like for K-12, the biggest thing that's in the plan is, of course, a big pile of cash. This round of coronavirus aid is about $40 billion. All totaled in the three coronavirus aid bills Congress has passed, the president signed. Higher ed has gotten about $77 billion. There's George barking at my cat. So there's a big pile of cash. As in the past, it's supposed to be split evenly between money for the institution and money for the students. The money was distributed to colleges based largely on a formula they devised that distributes it by the number of Pell students you have and your overall head count. That's different. The first bill was focused mostly on full-time enrollment, and as higher ed reporters will know, that community colleges and other institutions that enroll a lot of part-time students felt shortchanged by that. They've changed that formula a little bit, but so community colleges hopefully will get more, and with the decline in enrollment, they'll need it. There's a couple of interesting things in the bill. Congress has used this the past couple of times to make some policy changes. Most importantly, I think, although it's still a little bit speculative about the future, the bill will make any loan forgiveness that the government enacts in the future will make that forgiveness tax-free for students. That's a big deal, so that if you get, say, $10,000 in loan forgiveness, you don't immediately have to pay back a bunch of that in taxes. The bill also has created a process to close what's called the 90-10 loophole, and this is a real technical thing, but basically institutions are not supposed to receive more than 90% of their revenues from federal sources. In the past, that definition has only included what we call Title IV money, which is federal student aid distributed through the department. The goal here, I think, is eventually to include money that goes to students through, say, the GI Bill or tuition assistance for active duty military. Those will be big sources of revenue, and particularly this is meant to sort of regulate for-profit colleges that focus a lot of their recruiting on these military members of military or veterans, and it could negatively impact a number of those institutions because they use a lot of that money to defray the 90-10, to increase that 10% past the 10% essentially, because they don't get state appropriations or they don't have endowments. So it will make it a little more difficult for them to operate, but that is going to take several years to enact. There'll be a negotiated rulemaking process. So really, who knows what's going to happen with that? A couple of other interesting things in the bill. It requires colleges to use a portion to, quote, conduct direct outreach to financial aid applicants about the opportunity to receive a financial aid adjustment. So they're supposed to reach out to students and tell them if your family has, is in dire financial situation because a parent or somebody lost a job, you can come back to us and ask for more aid. And then the other thing is that colleges are supposed to use evidence-based practices to monitor and suppress coronavirus in accordance with public health guidelines. In some ways, colleges have a narrower range of areas where they can spend their money, including largely it's supposed to be geared towards costs related to the coronavirus, so lost revenue because of, say, their dorms aren't full or they don't have dining services. They can reimburse themselves for expenses they've already incurred, technology costs because they've had to upgrade their infrastructure to offer more online courses, faculty and staff training, and they can also make additional financial aid grants to students. And then students can use their money really. I mean, it's very loose, but I don't think anybody's going to be monitoring that. But it says emergency costs that arise due to coronavirus, such as tuition, food, housing, healthcare. The restrictions there, of course, would be hard for the department to monitor. But I think the way colleges are doing this is they are making most students apply for these funds and list a reason. I don't know that they're going in and asking anybody either about, are you really using this to spend it on say you're spending it on.
Yeah, that was one thing I was going to ask Eric. If students, how tangible students might see this money, if we might see students get like some tuition or fees kind of reimbursed, if you're hearing it from any colleges that have plans on doing that or cutting cost in the future, just sort of how tangible this money might be for students themselves.
You know, I mean, the law says they can use it for any component of their cost of attendance. So they could use it for tuition, food, and housing. Typically, the institutions, I think, are not supposed to use it to supplant other costs. Let's say, like, we'll give you this money as a tuition break, right? I think that would be sort of against the spirit of the law. So I think these are meant to be cash grants. And I think, for students that get it, it's probably going to be very helpful. A great question for reporters would be to look into how their colleges are requiring students to apply for these funds. Are they putting any criteria on this? Are they prioritizing low-income students or Pell-eligible students? Things like that would be, I think, very interesting. And then, look at how quickly they're dispersing the money to students in particular. The institution has, from the time they get the money, has a year to spend it. I know beginning with the first coronavirus aid bill, some colleges spread that out. And that makes sense, really, because, at the time, the future was very uncertain about what the fall would look like. Most institutions didn't see huge downturns in enrollment, but it made sense for the institutions to spread that out than the student funds.
Will this give, we have seen a significant drop in like FAFSA applications and enrollment rates in some community colleges. I know here in Tennessee it was about at least 10% enrollment drop. Will this give universities any way to help reach out to those, folks or help with those numbers?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know how the money itself helps them increase their application rates. I suppose they could use it to provide more outreach to students, more marketing, recruiting efforts. We haven't really seen, except at community colleges, we haven't seen a big downturn, except in freshmen. So, I think with an in-person fall planned at most institutions now, I think a lot of those folks will probably be coming back. Application numbers, I think, have been pretty strong. Even places like, I wrote about the Cal State University system, right? And despite them being entirely remote or mostly remote for the entire year, their enrollment was actually up. So that's good. I think the FAFSA question is a tough one. We're seeing a lot of low-income students and students of color drop out. The service industry is, of course, a wreck, and so students who might have thought about going to community college and working part-time or going to a four-year college and working part-time don't have that option. And so a lot of that, I think, is going to depend on the economic recovery, frankly, and how secure people feel about, taking out student loans or enrolling in a program, in the short-term future.
We've got an audience question, but I wanted you to remind us real quick, Eric, what is the total that higher ed institutions, like the total amount they're getting?
$77 billion. Okay. They got, and I'll put it in context like Andrew, I'll try to put it in context like Andrew did so helpfully. The federal government on Title IV aid spends somewhere north of $120 billion usually in loans and Pell Grants per year. Now, the American Council on Education has estimated that even all in with all the $77 billion that the federal government has sent to the institutions, that they still are suffering revenue losses, just a little less than $100 billion on top of that. So it's hard to gauge, what those numbers are based on necessarily, but clearly it's not going to cover all of their costs. The state and local money that's going through this bill will help states maintain some appropriations, I think. And there is in the bill a maintenance of effort provision, both for K-12 and for higher ed. So states can't take the coronavirus aid money and then cut higher ed, or just use higher ed money to the coronavirus aid money to supplant their appropriations. There'll be a limit to that.
Yeah, Andrew, can you touch on that real quick as well? The maintenance of effort for K-12, I know that's important for both.
Yeah, so basically maintenance of effort in the American Rescue Plan for K-12, it basically says for fiscal years, I believe 2022 and 23, says that you can't essentially make disproportionate cuts to K-12 relative to an average of recent fiscal years. I think that's fiscal years 2017, 18, and 19. So it's also important to note that I believe that states can seek waivers from that provision, so that in theory, if they got a waiver, they could make disproportionate cuts. I should point out here, and I should have mentioned it earlier, that if you step back and take a look at sort of the revenue forecasts for many states and how states are doing in terms of tax revenue, I wouldn't say it's a rosy picture, but a lot of states are probably not doing as badly as many folks, including many smart folks, might have predicted a year ago. That's not true for every state. I think there was a good New York Times analysis recently that found that Texas and Florida are two states where things are, relatively speaking, not looking so good. So there's that to consider as well in terms of looking at how your state is actually doing, and it may not be as bad as many people expected. We can get into this more, but I should also mention the maintenance of equity requirements. And just to sum that up very briefly, that gets really technical, but maintenance of equity touches on a long-running debate in Washington about equitable spending between schools inside school districts. And this basically tries to shield students in poverty, disadvantaged students, from disproportionate cuts. Not cuts overall, not shielding them from any and all cuts, but disproportionate cuts. There are state and local requirements for that, but that's something that many advocates have been seeking for some time, and they got a version of it, at least, into the American Rescue Plan.
For either K-12 schools or colleges and universities, are there requirements for them to report how they are spending the money? Are there any benchmarks along the way? What does that look like?
The higher ed piece, at least, requires them to submit reports to the federal government on the amount of money they've spent, and they're supposed to provide that information, I believe, on their websites as well. Yeah, if you're a reporter and you're curious, you should ask your institution, how much they've quantified and what they've spent it on. In particular, I would ask, among the student funds, I would ask if there's a percentage that can they quantify the number of students who are low income or Pell eligible that got the money.
Yeah, I would just quickly say, I think similar questions, there are similar questions reporters should be asking, especially their districts as well as states. And, just to throw something else into the mix, with in the 2009 stimulus, for those of you who remember or reported on it, there's a lot of attention on the federal government because there were these competitive grants. The most famous one is probably Race to the Top. But those competitive grants, which the federal government doled out back then, they sort of set the tone and the agenda for a lot of education reporting and narratives and fights, frankly. And this time around, including in the American Rescue Plan, we don't really have those competitive grants at the federal level. Joe Biden, in his blueprint, said he wanted them, called equity challenge grants. I think he wanted $5 billion for them. Congress said, nah. And I think part of the reason may have been because after Race to the Top and all the controversy it caused, there wasn't an appetite for it on Capitol Hill. So, you know, all that is to say that there's less of that. And so that just means more attention at the state and local level for, you know, how districts and states are using this money, and more sort of state and local reporting in terms of decisions, and maybe a bit less about, you know, like the federal government decisions about this. There will be some, but nothing really like Race to the Top.
Yeah, before we get to more audience questions, I was going to ask you guys just if you have any practical tips for local and state reporters for tracking these dollars, and also maybe what are some warning signs if they are tracking them, and warning signs that a district or a college might be spending the funds in a less effective way, or a red flag that like you as reporters would see and kind of question.
That's a good question in terms of. Oh, sorry, Eric, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, that's a good question about red flags. I mean, you know, there are a lot of people at education think tanks and researchers who have opinions about how this money should be used and are going to be monitoring what folks are doing. There are, you know, critics and supporters of different approaches. So if your district settles on an approach and makes it sound really simple and really straightforward, it's probably more complicated than that. And I think there are experts, you know, nationwide and maybe more locally who would have a different view. Maybe Megan's dog would have a different view, for example. It sounds like he might. And, you know, I also think with this kind of situation, there are a lot of different groups that get involved at the state and local level, like in terms of money, to use a term sloshing around, like local nonprofit groups at the state and local level, you know, education groups and business groups. They all kind of want to get involved in potentially good and bad ways. And so when those sorts of actors get involved, that provides sort of additional avenues for coverage and for accountability coverage, because when certain people get involved in efforts, even though, well, it may be well-intentioned, sometimes, you know, there are fair questions that can be asked about that. So those are a couple of sort of narrow, more specific ideas that might be helpful.
I would just go back to, you know, how hard or how easy are colleges making it for students to get this money? What kinds of hoops do they have to jump through? If they're raising the bar for students to get it, that's certainly a question to ask about why. Or if they're just giving it indiscriminately to everybody, which is probably not the case, but then you might ask, well, it's distributed on the basis of need for low-income students, and shouldn't you be directing it that way? In terms of spending on the institutional side, I mean, there is such latitude. Institutions have such latitude there that it's going to be hard to find any big problems if they're just sticking it away in the rainy day fund. I suppose in theory that's really not with the spirit of the law. Although I don't know, enforcement actions. I don't know what kind of enforcement actions the department would even consider for these issues. If they're giving everybody big races.
While we're talking about higher ed spending, we do have a question asking you to clarify the part about if colleges are allowed to use the money to make tuition reductions across the board. Jennifer in Ohio says we have a community college in Ohio that is going completely free in the fall using stimulus funds. However, some will also be used for direct grants. As long as they are doing that, are they okay to use some of this money to make tuition free this fall?
I think they can use their institutional funds that way. That's not a problem because the law allows them to use it as financial aid. I think the bigger question would be, are they offering the student portion of the money as to help cover tuition only? In other words, we're going to give you $500 in these emergency funds for students, but you have to sign up for this class and then we'll discount it $500, right? that's a way for the institution to keep the student portion of the money. And it's supposed to go directly to students. So that would be the area that I would be concerned about. The institutional funds, I think, if they're offering it as financial aid, essentially, that's not an issue.
Another question we have from Alan Richard at the Southern Regional Education Board, and this might be more of an Andrew question. Is this new investment in education a chance for the nation to close the opportunity gap or the inequities between school systems across each state? You talked a little bit about maintenance of equity for schools within districts. And are you hearing anything about states that are kind of making that a goal of theirs?
So just the first part of that question, yeah, there are, on the technical side, the maintenance of equity provisions I talked about earlier, they are designed to ensure that if there are any cuts happening, that they don't disproportionately hit, students in poverty, disadvantaged students. But that's sort of a narrower side of the question. Yeah, I think anytime you have this kind of infusion of money, and remember, over the past year and 3 relief packages, we're talking almost $200 billion for K-12. There is this balance between, how much of it is intended to catch students up and how much of it is used sort of in a more forward-looking way to think about how can we change how we do education so that it serves more students in a better way. These can sound like platitudes, but for example, for many states and for many state lawmakers, the answer is more school choice, right? We're seeing a lot of activity around efforts to expand school choice in different ways, and there's a whole separate debate about that. So I think the fact that there's this equity provision or set of equity provisions in the law does nod to that, but I think that it's the picture, as Alan's question sort of indicated, varies by states, and it's hard to paint a complete picture yet because these funds could be spent or allocated over many years. So it's too early to say, exactly how much progress is being made on that front, I think.
Kind of related question from Micah Myers, going off of learning recovery. Are you hearing anything about how these funds could be used to address social and emotional learning at both K-12 and higher ed levels? And I guess I'm thinking almost mental health services and some of those student-based, focus programs.
So the general answer is yes, they can be used to address that. The law doesn't really say, isn't prescriptive on that front, as it isn't prescriptive on many things. But I do know that this has been a priority for many districts, especially for those serving large shares of students who, have been absent from remote learning or were already disadvantaged before the pandemic hit. The strategies, I think, will vary. That gets into the question of, what's appropriate SEL, social emotional learning strategies for folks, but it is something that the districts can spend money on under the American Rescue Plan.
Did you have anything to add, Eric?
I know that certainly mental health issues have been a rising concern on college campuses over the past several years. I don't think there's any restrictions for institutions to use the institutional portion of that funding to improve mental health services. I haven't heard that that's widespread at all. I think mostly, but it's hard to know. The money gets so fungible. If you're just replacing revenue losses and what you spend it on becomes in some ways less apparent. It's easier to track the money you've lost and then how it's being used once you put it back. And also, a lot of college campuses are frankly either remote or hybrid. That's been, I think, a real challenge for institutions. Although I will say that, in some ways, the online, being online mostly has in some ways increased the accessibility of some services. People don't have to go to campus. They can reach out, they can make appointments online, they can talk to a counselor or a psychologist online. I don't know if that's better or for worse in terms of the therapeutic model, but it certainly levels the playing field in a sense for some students if they have a broadband access, if they have Wi-Fi access.
And just to tack onto that quickly, this is outside sort of the main K-12 emergency relief fund, but there's money for throwing a few other things in the pot. There's additional money for Head Start. There's money for the Department of Health and Human Services to deal. I don't want to sort of muddy the distinctions that are important between SEL and student mental health, but there's money to address child mental health issues through the Department of Health and Human Services. Not necessarily the most natural angle in terms of localizing stories, but I think the ways in which the money can be used, if folks can latch onto an angle, if their district is doing something with that of their state, I think those could be interesting stories too.
I've got a good logistical question, and I think I might try to answer it, and you guys add anything if I don't have it. It's how can we figure out how much each district in our state should expect to receive with this latest round? I think at this point, you should be able to go to your state Department of Ed and start seeing some of those allocations being made, and eventually they should be reporting that out because as federal funds, they'll be funneling through departments of education. I think another thing to watch is if local governments use funds towards schools. We've had that happen here in Nashville where some of their first round of CARES Act funding, our city mayor used to support Metro Nashville schools. So we'd probably start being able to see some of those numbers soon from individual states, departments of education.
Yeah, just to tack, I think that's right. Just to tack onto that, it's tricky at the district level because, that's where a lot of the money will end up. It goes out by, as I mentioned earlier, the Title I formula. So depending on the economic status of your sort of student enrollment in the district, the per student amount could vary widely. But based on what's been made available by the U.S. Department of Ed and information they've put out, and information that's actually been sort of available for about a week, state per student figures are available in addition to total state allocations. So at the district level, you might have to work with your district folks to try and figure that out. But if you move up the food chain a bit, those numbers should be out there.
Another question, and this goes back to some of those appropriate uses. Jeremy from Dayton Daily News says a local school district has been doing millions of work in HVAC improvements in schools this past year and last year and then this year. Would it be legal to essentially bank some of that money as a reimbursement for making those like ventilation upgrades? Do either of you know the answer to that?
So I'm not an attorney. I don't want to say whether it's legal or not. I'm also maybe it's obvious, but I'm hung up a little bit on the bank question. But I will just say that it is, in terms of upgrading HVAC and infrastructure related to COVID, it is an allowable use under the American Rescue Plan. But yeah, I'd want a bit more clarity especially before declaring something like legal or illegal. I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but yeah, I just want to be a little bit careful.
We won't cite you in a court of law, Andrew.
Thank you.
I think for higher ed too, this is the case where infrastructure upgrades to, especially if you frame it as something that's preventing the spread of coronavirus, that would be, I'm guessing that would be allowable.
Yeah. Going back to learning recovery or learning loss, you mentioned a district earlier, Andrew, in Texas, and I lost the question, but someone wanted to know what district. You mentioned that was doing, that already had an innovative plan.
So I believe, and I might be mispronouncing this, I believe that it's Urquhart County in Texas. I believe that's doing something along those lines. schools in that county, I think, are, and I left out several details, but I think that's the gist of it. And it's just, again, it just sort of shows how, you know, there are different approaches out there and you can combine different approaches. And I think some districts are getting really creative in interesting ways, and others may not be. And that's a good story in and of itself.
Yeah, can you share any other examples of either specific districts or approaches you're starting to see? I know I can think of, you mentioned tutoring, but for some of these learning loss attempts.
Yeah, so I mean, even like I'm thinking of, I think it's Orange County in Florida, where they're expanding summer school, and it also, but they're doing it for certain certain student populations. I think that effort also involves virtual tutoring. Again, this gets into like, you know, who's doing it. I think tutoring has been sort of a, dare I say, a sexy approach to this, and there are certainly, you know, upsides to it, I think, for many folks, but there are also a lot of questions that folks should be asking. I think the virtual tutoring is certainly an interesting one, especially where, you know, there's relatively good broadband access. By the way, I should note that American Rescue Plan also has over $7 billion for E-rates, which, for those of you who don't know, is basically designed to enhance internet access for schools and for students. Broadband internet, that is. So that's another example. You know, summer school has certain connotations of like just students falling asleep in a hot classroom in July, which, you know, obviously you want to avoid, but I think there are opportunities for districts to get creative even on the summer school front.
Yeah, I just want to plug, I've been doing some reporting on Tennessee is kind of doing some massive efforts to implement summer school that they're tying to COVID learning loss recovery, but also to a new 3rd grade reading gate that they're going to be rolling out in the coming years. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch here in Tennessee, but I'm really curious to see what other states do. Looking through the questions, is there anything from either the higher ed or K-12 side that you didn't see in these bills? Anything that was omitted that surprised you or you think isn't being tackled enough?
I honestly thought that there would be a pretty strong effort to enact some sort of student loan forgiveness in the bill. That's been a big priority of you know, the progressive side of the Democratic Party. Senator Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, is now you know, really been championing this issue. And I thought if anything that the senators might try and push some student loan relief in the package, but maybe it was too hard to get other Democrats on board for that.
I mentioned the absence. I know we're kind of running short on time. I mentioned earlier the absence of any of like the equity challenge grants, which would have been competitive grants. So I think that was interesting. And that's maybe not the most surprising necessarily, but maybe the most notable because Biden explicitly called for it and it's not in there.
We are at time, so thank you to our speakers and our moderator, Megan. There was one comment I just wanted to share from Wayne DeOrio, who says his dog wants to meet your dog, Megan, and thinks we might need to have a pet Zoom. So just wanted to pass that along. For the rest of our audience, thank you for coming, and just a quick reminder that you'll be getting that evaluation survey, so please fill it out. Again, thank you to our speakers. I hope you guys got a lot of ideas today. If not, I'm sure our speakers are open to emails. If you have any more questions or follow-ups, please feel free to contact them. So thanks again, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Take care.